I never thought I'd be the one standing in my childhood bedroom, watching strangers appraise my most precious memories while my father counted cash that would pay for his new wife's third nose job. My name is Jessica Martinez. I'm 28 years old, and the day I discovered what my dad had really done with our family home changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and the price of silence. What started as helping my stepmother Linda feel more confident about herself had spiraled into a financial nightmare that would cost us the only place I'd ever truly called home. But here's what neither my father nor Linda knew: I had been secretly building something that would make their monthly expenses look like pocket change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When the truth finally came out, it wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about respect, priorities, and learning that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. Growing up as Jessica Martinez in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, meant living in a house where the walls held more memories than most people collect in a lifetime. Our two-story Spanish-style home on Maple Street had been in my family since before I was born. My mother, Carmen Martinez, had chosen every tile in the kitchen, planted every rose bush in the front garden, and painted my bedroom the exact shade of lavender I'd begged for when I turned 7. The house wasn't just a building, it was the foundation of everything I understood about family stability and home. My father, Roberto Martinez, had worked double shifts at the aircraft manufacturing plant for 15 years to pay off the mortgage early. I still remember the celebration dinner we had when I was 12, the night he burned the final mortgage statement in our backyard fire pit while my mother cried happy tears, and I roasted marshmallows, not fully understanding the significance, but feeling the joy radiating from my parents. Those were the golden years, when our family felt unbreakable. My mother would wake up before dawn to pack my father's lunch with the same care she put into everything she did. She'd include little notes on napkins, drawings I'd made for him, sometimes a small piece of chocolate she'd saved from her own treat stash. My father would come home exhausted, but never too tired to help me with homework at the kitchen table, his work-roughened hands surprisingly gentle as he guided me through math problems I thought were impossible. Weekends meant family projects around the house. My mother teaching me to bake her famous tres leches cake in the kitchen, while my father built me a treehouse in the backyard oak tree that my mother had planted the year I was born. Sunday mornings were for church, followed by family barbecues, where my father would grill carne asada, while my mother and I prepared fresh salsa and guacamole, the house filling with the sounds of laughter and the smell of food made with love. My parents had met in high school, sweethearts who'd married young and built their dreams together one paycheck at a time. My mother worked part-time at a local elementary school as a teacher's aide, not because they needed the money, but because she loved working with children and it allowed her to be home when I got out of school. They were partners in every sense of the word, making decisions together, supporting each other's dreams, and creating a home where I felt completely safe and unconditionally loved. I was their only child, and while some might think that made me spoiled, the opposite was true. My parents taught me the value of hard work, the importance of education, and the strength that comes from family unity. My mother would spend hours helping me with school projects, not doing them for me, but guiding me to find my own solutions. My father taught me practical skills: how to fix a leaky faucet, how to change a tire, how to stand up for myself without losing my compassion for others. Our house was modest by some standards, but it was rich in love and tradition. The living room walls were covered with family photos spanning 3 generations. My grandmother's rocking chair sat by the window where the afternoon light was perfect for reading. The kitchen table where we shared every meal was scarred from years of homework, craft projects, and family game nights, each mark telling a story of time spent together. Everything changed the summer I turned 16. My mother had been feeling tired for months, attributing it to the busy school year and the extra hours she'd been putting in to help struggling students. When she finally went to the doctor, the word cancer fell into our lives like a stone thrown through glass, shattering everything we thought we knew about our future. The next 2 years became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and trying to maintain normalcy while watching the strongest woman I'd ever known fight for her life. My father took leave from work whenever possible to drive her to treatments. I learned to cook her favorite meals on days when she felt well enough to eat, and I held her hand during the nights when the pain medication wasn't enough. My mother faced her illness with the same grace she'd brought to everything else in her life. She worried more about how my father and I were coping than about her own suffering. During her good days, she'd insist on tending to her rose garden, teaching me which varieties bloomed at different times of year, how to prune them for maximum beauty, how to protect them during Arizona's harsh summers. She made lists, detailed instructions for maintaining the house, caring for the garden, preserving family traditions. She recorded herself reading my favorite childhood stories, just in case I ever wanted to hear her voice again. She wrote letters for my future milestones, graduations, my wedding day, the birth of my own children. She prepared us for a life without her with the same methodical care she'd brought to preparing our daily meals. The night before she died, she called me to her bedside and pressed a small key into my palm. "This is for the safety deposit box at First National Bank," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything you need to know is in there. Take care of your father, Misha, but don't forget to take care of yourself too. Promise me you'll always remember that this house, this family, is built on love, not just money or things." I promised, not understanding then how prophetic her words would prove to be. My mother passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning in October, the same month she'd always said was perfect for planting new roses. I was 18, a senior in high school, trying to navigate grief while maintaining my grades and helping my father learn to function in a world that suddenly felt empty without her presence. The year after my mother's death was the hardest of my life. My father, who had always been strong and decisive, seemed lost without his life partner. He stopped taking care of the house the way my mother had. The roses went untended, the kitchen gathered dust, and the warmth that had always filled our home seemed to drain away along with his will to maintain the routines that had once defined our family life. I threw myself into school and work, taking a part-time job at a local computer repair shop while finishing my senior year. I'd always been good with technology, something that had amused my parents who could barely figure out how to program the television remote. But working with computers gave me a sense of control in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable. My father started working longer hours, double shifts whenever they were available. I think he found it easier to stay busy than to come home to a house that reminded him of everything he'd lost. We ate dinner in silence, most nights, both of us lost in our own grief, neither of us sure how to comfort the other. I graduated high school with honors, earning a full scholarship to Arizona State University for computer science. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The scholarship covered tuition and books, but I continued working part-time to help with household expenses and to save money for the future my mother had always encouraged me to plan for. My father was proud. I could see it in his eyes during my graduation ceremony, but the joy felt muted without my mother there to share it. College became my escape and my salvation. I threw myself into programming classes, discovering a natural aptitude for coding that surprised even me. I made friends with other students who shared my passion for technology, and for the first time since my mother's death, I began to feel hopeful about the future again. I came home most weekends, partly to check on my father, and partly because I missed the house that still held so many precious memories. My father seemed to be adjusting slowly to life as a widower. He'd started taking better care of himself, eating regular meals, maintaining the house with something approaching his old attention to detail. I thought he was healing, learning to carry his grief while moving forward. I should have paid more attention to the changes I was seeing. My father, who had always been a creature of habit, started talking about making changes, meeting new people, exploring possibilities he'd never considered while my mother was alive. At the time, I thought this was healthy, a sign that he was processing his loss and beginning to consider what his future might look like. The first time he mentioned Linda, I was in my sophomore year at ASU. He brought her up casually during one of our weekly phone calls, describing her as a friend from his grief counseling group, someone who understood what it felt like to lose a spouse. Linda had been widowed 3 years earlier when her husband died in a motorcycle accident, leaving her to raise 2 teenage sons on her own. My father spoke about Linda with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard in his voice since before my mother's illness. She was funny, he said, and kind, and she had a way of making him laugh when he didn't think he remembered how. They'd started having coffee after their counseling sessions, then dinner occasionally, then longer conversations about their shared experiences with loss and their hopes for healing. I was genuinely happy for him. My mother had made me promise to take care of him, but she'd also made it clear that taking care of himself included allowing himself to love again if the opportunity arose. She'd been adamant that she didn't want him to spend the rest of his life alone, mourning her instead of living. When my father asked if he could bring Linda to our traditional Christmas dinner, I encouraged him to do so. I wanted to meet the woman who had brought light back into his eyes, who had helped him remember that life could include joy even after devastating loss. Linda arrived at our house on Christmas Eve wearing a red dress that was slightly too tight and makeup that was slightly too bold, but her smile was genuine and her nervousness was endearing. She was probably 10 years younger than my father, with bleached blonde hair and acrylic nails, but she made an effort to connect with me, asking about my studies and sharing stories about her own sons who were both in their early 20s. She complimented the house extensively, running her hands along the kitchen counters my mother had chosen, admiring the family photos that covered nearly every surface. She seemed particularly interested in the financial aspects of homeownership, asking questions about property values in our neighborhood, maintenance costs, and whether my father had considered updating various features of the house. At the time, I attributed her curiosity to the natural interest of someone who was potentially thinking about a future with my father. Looking back, I can see there were signs I should have noticed, questions that seemed more calculating than curious, comments that revealed priorities I didn't initially recognize. Linda's sons, Miguel and Carlos, were polite but distant during that first meeting. They seemed uncomfortable in our house, making it clear they saw this relationship as their mother's attempt to secure financial stability rather than genuine romantic connection. Miguel, the older son at 23, made several pointed comments about his mother deserving nice things after years of struggling as a single parent. Carlos, 21 and still living at home, was more direct in his skepticism about the relationship. During a moment when Linda and my father were in the kitchen, he told me bluntly that his mother had a pattern of dating men who could provide the lifestyle she felt she deserved. He warned me to be careful, that Linda had expensive tastes and a talent for making men feel responsible for fulfilling her dreams. I dismissed his warnings as the natural protectiveness of sons, who weren't ready to see their mother with anyone other than their deceased father. I thought they were being unfairly judgmental, that they couldn't see past their own grief to recognize that their mother deserved happiness and companionship. My father seemed happier than he'd been since my mother's death. He started taking care of his appearance again, buying new clothes, getting regular haircuts, talking about plans for the future that extended beyond just getting through each day. He and Linda began spending most weekends together, alternating between our house and her apartment across town. Linda's apartment was a stark contrast to our family home. Where our house was filled with memories and personal touches accumulated over decades, her place felt temporary and impersonal. She rented a one-bedroom unit in a complex that prioritized amenities over character, with a pool, fitness center, and clubhouse that she used regularly but that felt hollow compared to the deep roots my family had put down in our neighborhood. The relationship progressed quickly, maybe too quickly for a man who had been married to the same woman for over 20 years. Within 6 months of their first meeting, Linda was spending most nights at our house, gradually moving her belongings into the spaces my mother had once occupied. She rearranged furniture, replaced family photos with generic art, and started making changes to the house that felt like erasure of my mother's presence. I was finishing my junior year at ASU when my father called to tell me he and Linda were getting married. The wedding would be small, just immediate family and a few close friends, but he wanted my blessing and my presence as his best woman, since I was the most important person in his life. I gave my blessing because I wanted him to be happy, because my mother had made me promise to support his decisions, and because I believed Linda genuinely cared for him, even if her motivations weren't entirely pure. I thought marriage might settle some of the dynamic I'd been observing, the subtle ways Linda seemed to be testing boundaries and measuring my father's willingness to provide for her desires. The wedding took place in our backyard, under the oak tree where my father had built my childhood treehouse, where my mother had taught me to identify different types of birds, where we'd scattered some of her ashes according to her final wishes. Linda wore white, which seemed inappropriate for a second marriage, but she looked genuinely happy as she exchanged vows with my father. Linda's sons attended but remained visibly uncomfortable throughout the ceremony. During the reception, Miguel pulled me aside to reiterate his warnings about his mother's spending habits and her tendency to view relationships as financial opportunities. He told me she'd already started talking about renovations she wanted to make to the house, improvements she felt were necessary to bring the property up to her standards. I thanked him for his concern, but assured him that my father was a responsible man who wouldn't make financial decisions without careful consideration. I believed my father's experience as a homeowner and his years of managing family finances would protect him from any manipulation, that his love for Linda wouldn't blind him to practical realities. I was wrong about almost everything. The first few months of their marriage seemed to go smoothly. Linda settled into life in our house, though she continued to make small changes that gradually erased more traces of my mother's presence. She replaced my mother's kitchen curtains with blinds that blocked more light. She donated my mother's books to charity without asking if I wanted them. She moved my mother's rocking chair to the garage, claiming it didn't fit the aesthetic she was trying to create. Each change felt like a small violation, but I told myself that Linda had the right to make the house feel like her home too. My father seemed oblivious to the way these alterations were affecting me, or perhaps he was deliberately ignoring my discomfort to avoid conflict in his new marriage. Linda quit her part-time job at a local retail store shortly after the wedding, claiming that being a full-time homemaker was a better use of her time and energy. She talked about wanting to focus on taking care of my father, maintaining the house, and building relationships in the neighborhood. My father supported this decision, saying he made enough money to support them both, and that Linda's happiness was worth more than her modest income. Without the structure of a job, Linda seemed to have unlimited time to focus on everything she felt was wrong with the house and her life in general. She started making lists of improvements she wanted to implement, researching contractors for projects she deemed essential, and developing increasingly expensive tastes in furniture, clothing, and entertainment. The first major expense was a kitchen renovation that Linda insisted was necessary for health and safety reasons. She claimed the original cabinets contained lead paint, that the countertops were made from materials that could harbor bacteria, and that the appliances were so outdated they posed fire hazards. My father, who had never been particularly handy, but who trusted Linda's judgment about domestic matters, agreed to the renovation. The kitchen project cost nearly $15,000, money my father borrowed against his retirement account despite my gentle suggestions that such a major expense should be planned and saved for rather than financed through debt. Linda supervised every detail of the renovation, changing orders multiple times and adding features that increased the final cost significantly beyond the original estimate. When the renovation was complete, Linda hosted a party to show off the new kitchen to her friends from the gym and her book club. I attended the party during a weekend visit home, watching Linda play hostess in what had once been my mother's sacred space. The new kitchen was beautiful but cold, all granite and stainless steel where my mother's kitchen had been warm wood and ceramic tile chosen for durability and comfort rather than impression. Linda seemed to thrive on the attention and compliments from her guests, basking in their praise for her design choices and her ability to transform the space. She made several comments about how much better the house looked now, how much more modern and sophisticated it felt, how lucky my father was to have someone with such good taste to help him improve his property. The kitchen renovation was just the beginning. Over the following months, Linda identified problems with nearly every aspect of the house that had been perfectly functional for decades. The bathroom fixtures were outdated and needed to be replaced. The carpets were worn and potentially unhealthy. The paint colors were depressing and needed to be updated with more contemporary choices. Each project seemed reasonable when Linda first proposed it, but the costs consistently exceeded estimates as she made changes and additions during the work process. My father, who had once been meticulous about budgeting and planning major expenses, seemed unable to say no to Linda's requests. He took on increasing amounts of debt to fund her improvements, borrowing against his retirement savings and eventually taking out a home equity loan against the house. I tried to express my concerns during my regular visits home, but my father dismissed my worries as the natural anxiety of a young person who didn't understand adult relationships or the realities of homeownership. He assured me that the improvements were increasing the value of the house, that Linda had done extensive research to ensure they were making smart investments in their future. Linda was always present during these conversations, nodding along with my father's explanations and adding her own reassurances about the wisdom of their decisions. She talked about property values in the neighborhood, comparable sales of renovated homes, and the importance of maintaining a property that reflected their status as successful, established adults. What I didn't understand at the time was the psychological manipulation that was taking place. Linda had identified my father's vulnerabilities, his desire to be seen as a good provider, his fear of losing another woman he loved, his guilt about moving on from my mother's memory. She used these vulnerabilities to justify increasingly expensive requests, framing each expenditure as proof of his love for her or evidence of his commitment to their shared future. By the time I graduated from college with my computer science degree, my father had accumulated nearly $60,000 in debt funding Linda's home improvements. The house looked beautiful, magazine-ready in a way it had never been during my childhood, but it no longer felt like home to me. Every surface, Every room, every detail had been transformed according to Linda's vision, erasing the warmth and personality that had made it special. I landed a job with a software development company in Tempe, allowing me to stay in the Phoenix area and visit my father regularly while building my career. The starting salary was modest but promising, with opportunities for advancement and stock options that could become valuable if the company continued to grow. My father was proud of my success, though Linda seemed less impressed by my accomplishment. She made several comments about the low starting salaries in technology fields, the uncertainty of working for small companies, and the lack of traditional benefits compared to my father's manufacturing job. She suggested I might be better served finding a position with a larger, more established company that could provide the security and status that came with corporate employment. I was happy with my job and excited about the projects I was working on, but Linda's subtle criticisms made me feel defensive about my choices. She had a way of undermining confidence, while appearing to offer helpful advice, expressing concern about my future while suggesting that my decisions showed poor judgment or unrealistic expectations. The pattern continued throughout my first year of employment. Linda would identify problems that needed solving, research solutions that invariably required significant financial investment, and present my father with detailed plans for improvements that would enhance their quality of life. My father, increasingly convinced that his role as a husband was to provide whatever Linda needed to be happy, continued to agree to expenses that pushed them deeper into debt. The second major project was landscaping, which Linda deemed necessary because the yard looked shabby compared to other homes in the neighborhood. She hired a designer who created an elaborate plan involving new irrigation systems, imported plants, decorative stonework, and outdoor lighting that would transform the modest family yard into something resembling a resort property. The landscaping project cost $25,000, money my father borrowed by increasing the home equity loan he'd taken out for the kitchen renovation. Linda supervised the work with the same attention to detail she'd brought to the kitchen, making changes and additions that increased costs while creating the outdoor space she felt they deserved. When the landscaping was complete, Linda organized another party, this time an outdoor barbecue to showcase the new yard to an even larger group of friends and acquaintances. She hired caterers for the event, purchased new outdoor furniture, and bought a wardrobe of summer dresses specifically for the occasion. I attended the party and watched Linda hold court among her guests, accepting compliments on her design vision and her ability to transform the property. Several people commented on how lucky my father was to have found someone with such sophisticated taste, how much the improvements had enhanced the value of his investment, how impressive it was that he was able to provide such a beautiful lifestyle for his new wife. My father beamed with pride throughout the party, clearly enjoying the recognition and admiration Linda was receiving. He made several comments about how Linda had taught him to see the potential in their property, how much happier he was living in a home that reflected their shared vision for the future. But I could see the stress beneath his smile, the way his jaw tightened when people asked about the cost of the improvements, the careful way he avoided discussing specific financial details. He was proud of what they'd accomplished but worried about the debt they'd accumulated in the process. After the party, as we cleaned up the yard and stored the new furniture, Linda began talking about her next project. She'd been researching interior designers who could help them update the living room and dining room to match the quality of the kitchen renovation. She'd also been looking into bathroom remodeling, since the current fixtures looked dated compared to the sophisticated aesthetic they'd established in other parts of the house. I tried to raise questions about the wisdom of taking on additional debt, but Linda quickly redirected the conversation to focus on property values and long-term investment strategy. She pulled out real estate listings for comparable homes in the neighborhood, pointing out how much more expensive properties with similar renovations were selling for. My father nodded along with Linda's analysis, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. The debt was mounting faster than he'd anticipated, and his retirement account had been significantly depleted to fund the improvements. He was still several years away from retirement age, but the financial pressure was beginning to affect his sleep and his overall stress levels. That night, after Linda had gone to bed, my father and I sat in the new kitchen drinking coffee and talking about my job, my future plans, my mother's memory. During a lull in the conversation, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about picking up some overtime shifts to help manage the household expenses. I asked gently about their financial situation, expressing concern about the amount of debt they'd taken on in such a short period. My father assured me that everything was under control, that the improvements were investments that would pay for themselves over time, that Linda had done extensive research to ensure they were making smart decisions. But I could hear the doubt in his voice, the way he repeated Linda's justifications without the conviction he'd shown 6 months earlier. He was beginning to question the wisdom of their spending, but he was also terrified of disappointing Linda or creating conflict in their marriage. I offered to help with financial planning, suggesting we could create a budget together that would allow them to enjoy their improvements while getting their debt under control. My father thanked me for the offer but declined, saying that financial management was his responsibility and that he didn't want to burden me with adult concerns. What I didn't know was that Linda had already begun planning her most expensive project yet, one that would push their debt beyond any reasonable limit and ultimately threaten the security of the house my mother had loved so deeply. The bathroom renovation she'd mentioned casually was just the beginning of a transformation plan that would cost more than all their previous projects combined. Linda had become obsessed with the idea of creating a master suite that would rival the luxury hotels she'd seen in magazines and online. She envisioned a spa-like bathroom with a jetted tub, a separate shower with multiple heads, heated floors and fixtures that would create an atmosphere of daily indulgence. But the bathroom was just one component of her vision. She also wanted to expand the master bedroom, adding a sitting area and a walk-in closet that would accommodate the designer wardrobe she felt she deserved as the wife of a successful man. She'd been researching contractors who specialized in luxury home additions, getting quotes for work that would cost more than my father's annual salary. The most expensive element of Linda's plan, the one that would ultimately lead to the mortgage crisis that changed everything, was cosmetic surgery. Linda had been dissatisfied with her appearance since her early 20s, convinced that minor adjustments would dramatically improve her self-confidence and her quality of life. She'd researched plastic surgeons in Scottsdale who specialized in facial procedures, breast augmentation, and body contouring. She'd scheduled consultations with multiple doctors, getting detailed quotes for the combination of procedures she felt would help her achieve the appearance she'd always wanted. The total cost for Linda's surgical procedures would be nearly $40,000, money my father didn't have and couldn't borrow through conventional means. But Linda had a solution that she presented to my father as a temporary measure, a short-term financial strategy that would allow her to have the surgery while preserving their long-term financial stability. She suggested they take out a second mortgage on the house, using the equity they'd built up over decades of payments to fund her cosmetic procedures and the master suite renovation. She framed this as an investment in their future together, explaining that the improvements would increase the value of the property while the surgery would improve her self-esteem and their relationship. My father was initially resistant to the idea of mortgaging the house he'd worked so hard to pay off, the house that represented security and stability for our family. But Linda persisted, presenting research about property values, statistics about the return on investment for home improvements, and emotional arguments about her need to feel beautiful and confident in their marriage. She reminded my father of how much happier he'd been since their relationship began, how much the previous improvements had enhanced their quality of life, how important it was for him to show his support for her personal goals, just as she'd supported his professional ambitions throughout their marriage. The manipulation was subtle but effective. Linda positioned the mortgage as a test of my father's love for her, a measure of his commitment to their shared future, proof that he valued her happiness above his own financial concerns. She made him feel responsible for her self-esteem, while positioning herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. My father, who had spent 25 years building a debt-free life with my mother, agreed to mortgage the house to pay for Linda's plastic surgery and home renovations. The decision would cost him everything he'd worked for, and ultimately destroy the security he'd tried so hard to provide for his family. But I didn't know any of this was happening until it was too late to stop it. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing code for a major client presentation. My father's voice was strained, barely above a whisper, and I could hear Linda crying dramatically in the background. "Jessica," he said, "we need to talk. Can you come over tonight after work? There's something important we need to discuss as a family." I agreed immediately, sensing the urgency in his tone, even though he was clearly trying to sound calm. The rest of my workday dragged by as I wondered what could be so serious that it required an in-person family meeting. My mind raced through possibilities, most of them involving health issues or job problems, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to discover. I arrived at the house around 6:30, parking behind a car I didn't recognize in our driveway. Through the front window, I could see Linda pacing in the living room, gesticulating wildly while speaking to someone I couldn't see. My father met me at the door, his face gray with stress and exhaustion, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Inside, I discovered the stranger was a mortgage broker named David Chen, a thin man in his 50s wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a briefcase full of documents. Linda had finally stopped pacing and was perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes red from crying but her expression determined rather than defeated. My father gestured for me to sit down, then took a deep breath and began explaining the situation with the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times. Over the past 6 months, he said, they had encountered some unexpected expenses related to essential home improvements and Linda's medical needs. They had explored various financing options and determined that refinancing the house was the most practical solution for their circumstances. Linda jumped in immediately, her voice high and defensive as she elaborated on my father's sanitized explanation. She talked about the urgent need for the master suite renovation, claiming that their current bedroom setup was causing her chronic back pain that required medical attention. She mentioned structural issues with the house that needed immediate repair to prevent more serious problems down the road. The medical expenses she referenced were her plastic surgery procedures, though she described them as necessary treatments for self-esteem issues that were affecting her mental health and their marriage. She had consulted with multiple doctors, who all agreed that cosmetic surgery was the best solution for her psychological well-being, and she'd found a surgeon who could perform all the procedures she needed at a significant discount if she paid in cash up front. David Chen spread paperwork across our coffee table, explaining the terms of the mortgage my father had already agreed to sign. The loan amount was $120,000, which seemed astronomical for a house my father had paid off years earlier. The monthly payments would be nearly $1,500, a significant burden on my father's manufacturing salary, but Chen assured us that the terms were favorable given current market conditions. I listened in growing horror as the true scope of their financial situation became clear. The previous home improvements had been financed through credit cards and personal loans that were now requiring monthly payments my father could barely manage. The new mortgage would provide enough cash to pay off existing debt while funding Linda's surgery and the master suite renovation, but it would also mean starting over with house payments that would continue long into my father's retirement years. Linda dominated the conversation, presenting their decision as a carefully considered financial strategy rather than a desperate attempt to fund her cosmetic procedures. She had researched property values extensively, she claimed, and determined that the improvements would increase the house's worth by more than the amount they were borrowing. She talked about comparable sales in the neighborhood, renovation costs versus property value increases, and the importance of maintaining a home that reflected their status in the community. My father sat silently through most of Linda's presentation, occasionally nodding when she looked to him for confirmation, but clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. When I asked direct questions about the necessity of borrowing such a large amount, he deferred to Linda's explanations rather than offering his own perspective on their financial decisions. The mortgage broker seemed eager to complete the transaction, emphasizing the time-sensitive nature of the interest rate they'd been offered and the importance of moving quickly to secure favorable terms. He had brought all the necessary paperwork for my father to sign that evening, claiming that waiting even a few days could result in less advantageous loan conditions. I tried to ask questions about alternatives, whether they had considered less expensive options for the renovations, whether Linda's procedures could be postponed until they had saved the money rather than borrowed it, whether they had fully explored the long-term implications of taking on such significant debt so close to my father's retirement age. Linda became increasingly agitated with my questions, interpreting my concern as criticism of her needs and my father's decision-making ability. She accused me of being unsupportive of their marriage, of failing to understand adult responsibilities, of trying to control decisions that didn't concern me since I no longer lived in the house full-time. My father finally spoke up, his voice tired but firm as he told me that the decision had already been made. He appreciated my concern, he said, but Linda was his wife and her happiness was his priority. The improvements were necessary, the medical procedures were important for Linda's well-being, and the mortgage was simply a tool to help them achieve their goals while maintaining their quality of life. I watched my father sign document after document, his signature becoming less steady with each page as the reality of what he was doing seemed to sink in. David Chen collected the paperwork efficiently, promising that the loan would be funded within 2 weeks and that they could begin their renovations and medical procedures as soon as the money was available. After Chen left, Linda immediately began making phone calls to contractors and medical offices, scheduling appointments and confirming dates for work that would begin as soon as the mortgage funds were released. She was energized by the successful completion of the loan process, talking excitedly about timeline for the renovations and her surgery recovery period. My father looked exhausted, sitting in his recliner with his head in his hands while Linda planned their immediate future. When I approached him to express my concerns privately, he waved me off, saying that the stress of the decision-making process had worn him out, but that he was confident they were doing the right thing for their marriage and their future. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the few possessions Linda hadn't relocated or donated, trying to process what I had witnessed. My father, who had always been conservative with money and proud of his debt-free lifestyle, had just mortgaged the house he'd worked 15 years to pay off. The monthly payments would strain his budget significantly, and at 58 years old, he was taking on debt that would extend well into his retirement years. The next few weeks passed quickly as Linda threw herself into preparing for her various procedures and renovations. She had scheduled her surgeries for late August, planning a recovery period that would coincide with the completion of the master suite renovation. The timing, she explained, would allow her to heal in beautiful surroundings, while the house underwent its final transformation into the luxury home she'd always envisioned. I tried to maintain a supportive presence while struggling with my own feelings about their decisions. I helped Linda research post-surgery care requirements and assisted my father with finding contractors who could complete the bedroom expansion within their timeline. I told myself that my role was to be helpful rather than judgmental, that my father was an adult capable of making his own choices even if I disagreed with them. The mortgage funds were released on schedule, and Linda immediately paid for her surgical procedures in cash, receiving the discount she'd negotiated for upfront payment. The remaining money went toward paying off existing credit card debt and funding the master suite renovation, which Linda had expanded to include custom built-in furniture and high-end finishes that would create the spa-like atmosphere she desired. Linda's first surgery was a breast augmentation, followed 2 weeks later by a rhinoplasty and facial procedures that would require several weeks of recovery time. My father took vacation days to drive her to appointments and care for her during the initial healing period, learning to manage surgical drains and medication schedules while coordinating with contractors who were demolishing walls and installing new plumbing for the expanded master suite. The house became chaotic during this period, with construction noise during the day and Linda's recovery needs requiring constant attention in the evenings. My father looked increasingly worn down by the dual pressures of caring for his wife and managing a major renovation project, but he maintained that everything was proceeding according to plan. I visited frequently during this time, bringing meals and helping with errands that my father couldn't manage while Linda was recovering. I watched contractors gut the master bedroom and bathroom, removing walls and fixtures that had been part of the house's original structure to create space for Linda's vision of luxury living. The renovation revealed problems that hadn't been apparent during the planning stages. The electrical system needed upgrading to support the new lighting and heated floors Linda had specified. The plumbing required more extensive modification than anticipated to accommodate the jetted tub and multiple shower heads she'd selected. Each discovery added time and money to the project, pushing costs beyond the original estimates. Linda, despite being in recovery from surgery, remained actively involved in every decision about the renovation. She insisted on premium materials and finishes, arguing that since they were making such a significant investment, they should ensure the results justified the expense. When contractors suggested less expensive alternatives, she rejected them as inferior options that would compromise the quality of their investment. My father struggled to manage the cost overruns while Linda was unable to work or help with household responsibilities. The renovation budget, which had seemed adequate when they planned the project, proved insufficient for Linda's vision of luxury. My father began using credit cards again to cover the additional expenses, rebuilding debt they had just paid off with the mortgage proceeds. I tried to discuss the financial implications with my father during one of Linda's medical appointments, but he insisted that the temporary stress was worth the long-term benefits they would enjoy. Linda had researched everything thoroughly, he reminded me, and the improvements would increase the house's value significantly. The current difficulties were simply the price of achieving their goals. By September, Linda had recovered enough from her surgeries to resume supervising the renovation work, and I could see that the procedures had achieved the results she'd hoped for. She looked younger and more confident, frequently admiring herself in mirrors and taking photographs to document her transformation. The physical changes had indeed improved her self-esteem, and she carried herself with new assurance as she interacted with contractors and neighbors. The master suite renovation was completed in October, creating a bedroom and bathroom that looked like they belonged in an upscale hotel rather than a modest family home. Linda had achieved her vision of daily luxury, with marble countertops, heated floors, a jetted tub, and a walk-in closet that accommodated the designer wardrobe she'd been gradually acquiring. Linda organized another party to showcase the completed renovation, inviting an even larger group of friends and acquaintances to admire the transformation. The master suite was indeed impressive, and guests were effusive in their praise for Linda's design vision and my father's generosity in providing such beautiful accommodations for his wife. But I could see the strain in my father's face as people complimented him on his ability to provide such luxury for Linda. The mortgage payments were stretching his budget significantly, and the cost overruns had depleted his emergency savings. He was working overtime whenever possible to manage the monthly expenses, and the stress was affecting his health and his sleep. Linda seemed oblivious to my father's stress, basking in the attention and admiration her transformation had generated. She talked confidently about future projects, mentioning her interest in landscaping improvements and kitchen updates that would bring the rest of the house up to the standard they'd established in the master suite. I realized with growing alarm that Linda viewed the mortgage as just the beginning of their renovation journey, rather than a major financial commitment that should be managed carefully. She had developed expensive tastes during the process of transforming the house, and she seemed to expect that my father would continue finding ways to fund her vision regardless of the financial pressure it created. The first missed payment happened in November, just 3 months after the mortgage began. My father had been confident that his overtime income would cover the monthly obligation, but unexpected medical bills related to Linda's surgery recovery had depleted his checking account. He called the mortgage company to explain the situation and arrange a payment plan, assuring them that it was a temporary setback rather than an ongoing problem. Linda was furious about the missed payment, not because she was concerned about their financial situation, but because she felt it reflected poorly on their status and responsibility as homeowners. She insisted that my father find a way to bring the account current immediately, suggesting he could borrow money from his retirement account or ask for an advance on his salary. My father managed to make the November payment by borrowing against his 401k, but the pattern was established. The mortgage payments were simply too large for his income, especially with the additional credit card debt they'd accumulated during the renovation cost overruns. Each month became a scramble to find enough money to meet their obligations while maintaining the lifestyle Linda had established. December brought additional financial pressure as Linda insisted on an elaborate Christmas celebration that would showcase their beautiful home to extended family and friends. She hired caterers, bought expensive decorations, and purchased gifts that reflected their new status as a successful, sophisticated couple. The holiday expenses added thousands of dollars to their credit card balances, money they couldn't afford but that Linda deemed necessary for maintaining appearances. I spent Christmas Day watching my father try to hide his financial anxiety while Linda played hostess to a house full of guests who admired the renovations and complimented her appearance. Linda glowed under the attention, clearly feeling that all the expense and stress had been worthwhile to achieve the recognition and admiration she'd always craved. But late that night, after the guests had gone home and Linda had gone to bed exhausted from the day's festivities, my father sat me down in the new kitchen and finally admitted the full scope of their financial crisis. The mortgage payments were consuming nearly half his monthly income, leaving barely enough money for basic living expenses. The credit card debt was growing every month as they used borrowed money to bridge the gap between income and obligations. He was considering taking early retirement to access his pension benefits, even though it would mean a significant reduction in his monthly income for the rest of his life. He'd also been looking into part-time jobs he could take in addition to his manufacturing work, though at his age and with his skills the opportunities were limited and poorly paid. My father looked defeated as he described their situation, clearly realizing that the decisions he'd made to make Linda happy had created an unsustainable financial burden. But he felt trapped by his commitment to his marriage and his fear that admitting failure would destroy his relationship with Linda, who had made it clear that the lifestyle improvements were essential to her happiness. I offered to help with financial planning, suggesting we could create a budget that would allow them to manage their debt while maintaining their basic needs. But my father was reluctant to make changes that would require Linda to give up the lifestyle she'd established, fearing that any reduction in their standard of living would be seen as a betrayal of his promises to provide for her. The conversation ended with my father asking me not to mention our discussion to Linda, who he felt was still adjusting to her post-surgery recovery and didn't need the additional stress of financial concerns. He assured me that he would find a way to manage their obligations without requiring sacrifice from Linda, though he couldn't explain how he planned to accomplish this impossible goal. January brought the first foreclosure notice, a certified letter that arrived while Linda was at her book club meeting. My father opened it with shaking hands, reading the legal language that informed him he was in default on his mortgage and had 30 days to bring the account current or face legal action to recover the property. The missed payments had accumulated to over $4,000, and the mortgage company was demanding immediate payment of the full amount plus late fees and legal costs. My father called me in a panic, his voice breaking as he read the notice over the phone and asked for advice about options he might not have considered. I drove to the house immediately, finding my father sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by financial documents and calculator, trying to find money that simply didn't exist. His retirement account had been depleted by previous borrowing, his credit cards were maxed out from renovation overruns and living expenses, and his salary was barely covering their monthly obligations even when he worked significant overtime. Linda returned from her book club meeting to find us discussing the foreclosure notice, and her reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused my father of mismanaging their finances, of failing to communicate with the mortgage company properly, of not working hard enough to ensure their payments were made on time. She seemed genuinely shocked that their financial situation had deteriorated so quickly, as if she had been unaware of the pressure her spending had created. The fight that followed was devastating to witness. Linda blamed my father for agreeing to expenses he couldn't afford, while my father tried to explain that he had been trying to make her happy by providing the lifestyle she wanted. Linda accused him of being irresponsible with money, while my father pointed out that every major expense had been her idea and her priority. Linda ultimately stormed out of the house, driving to her son Miguel's apartment to spend the night rather than continuing the argument. My father and I were left to figure out how to respond to the foreclosure notice with no realistic options for raising the money they needed to save the house. Over the following weeks, my father explored every possible solution he could imagine. He contacted credit counseling services, spoke with bankruptcy attorneys, and researched programs for homeowners facing foreclosure. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Their debt obligations exceeded his income by a significant margin, and there was no realistic way to close the gap without major lifestyle changes that Linda refused to consider. Linda returned after 3 days at Miguel's apartment, but the dynamic in the house had shifted permanently. She was no longer the confident woman who had supervised renovations and planned parties. Instead, she seemed angry and resentful, as if my father had deliberately deceived her about their financial capacity rather than simply agreeing to expenses he couldn't afford in an attempt to make her happy. The stress affected every aspect of their daily life. Linda stopped cooking the elaborate meals she'd enjoyed preparing in her renovated kitchen. My father began working double shifts whenever possible, leaving the house before dawn and returning after Linda had gone to bed. They communicated primarily through terse notes left on the kitchen counter, coordinating schedules and responsibilities without the warmth that had once characterized their relationship. I found myself visiting more frequently, trying to help them navigate the crisis while watching two people I cared about destroy their marriage and their financial security through a combination of poor decisions and incompatible priorities. Linda still couldn't understand why my father couldn't simply find more money somewhere, while my father couldn't explain how to create income that didn't exist. The second foreclosure notice arrived in February, escalating the legal language and shortening the timeline for response. My father had managed to make a partial payment that prevented immediate legal action, but the mortgage company was no longer willing to work with him on payment plans or modifications. They wanted full payment of all missed amounts, or they would proceed with foreclosure proceedings. Linda's response to the second notice was to suggest that my father take out another loan, perhaps against his life insurance policy, or by borrowing money from family members or friends. She seemed unable to grasp that they had already exhausted all possible sources of credit and that no one was going to lend them money they clearly couldn't repay. The suggestion that my father ask relatives for help was particularly painful because our family had always been self-sufficient and proud of our financial independence. My father had never borrowed money from anyone, and the idea of admitting his financial failure to cousins and siblings was almost as devastating as the prospect of losing the house. I realized during this period that Linda had never really understood the difference between having money and having access to credit. Throughout their relationship, my father had been able to fund her desires by borrowing against assets he'd accumulated over decades of careful saving and responsible financial management. When those assets were depleted and his credit was exhausted, she interpreted his inability to continue spending as unwillingness rather than impossibility. The crisis came to a head in March when Linda discovered that my father had been exploring the possibility of selling the house voluntarily to avoid foreclosure. She found real estate listings he'd printed out, showing recent sales of comparable properties in the neighborhood that might give them an idea of what they could expect if they decided to sell before the bank forced them out. Linda was outraged by the suggestion that they should sell the house she'd spent so much time and money renovating. She accused my father of giving up too easily, of failing to fight for their home and their future together. She couldn't understand that selling voluntarily might allow them to pay off the mortgage and start over with a smaller place they could actually afford. The fight that followed was the end of their marriage in everything but legal terms. Linda accused my father of destroying her dreams and her security through his financial incompetence. My father finally lost his patience and told Linda that her expensive tastes and unrealistic expectations had created the crisis they were facing. They said things to each other that couldn't be taken back, revealing resentments and disappointments that had been building since their financial problems began. Linda moved out the next day, taking her clothes and personal belongings but leaving behind all the expensive furniture and fixtures she'd selected for the house renovations. She went to stay with Miguel permanently this time, telling my father that she couldn't live with someone who wasn't committed to providing the lifestyle she deserved. My father was relieved and devastated simultaneously. The marriage was clearly over, but he was left alone in a house he couldn't afford, surrounded by renovations that reminded him daily of the poor decisions that had led to his current situation. The monthly mortgage payments didn't decrease just because Linda had moved out, and his income alone was completely insufficient to maintain the property. With Linda gone, my father finally admitted the full scope of their financial disaster. In addition to the mortgage payments, they had accumulated over $30,000 in credit card debt funding renovation overruns and Linda's lifestyle expenses. His retirement savings had been completely depleted, and he was facing the prospect of working well into his 70s just to cover his basic living expenses. The house that had once represented security and family heritage had become a financial burden that was destroying my father's future. Every month that he struggled to make payments was another month of accumulating late fees and penalties that made their situation worse. The renovations that were supposed to increase the property's value had created a house that was beautiful but unaffordable for someone with my father's income. I realized that my father needed help beyond emotional support and financial advice. He needed someone to take control of the situation and make the difficult decisions he was too overwhelmed and exhausted to make himself. But what I didn't know yet was that I had resources and capabilities that could change everything about our circumstances. The solution to my father's crisis was closer than either of us imagined, hidden in the success I'd been building quietly while his life was falling apart. The third foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday in April, and this time there was no room for negotiation. My father had until the end of the month to vacate the property or face legal eviction. He called me at work, his voice hollow as he read the final warning that would end our family's connection to the house that had sheltered 3 generations of memories. I sat in my office overlooking downtown Tempe, watching my father's world crumble while surrounded by evidence of my own success that he knew nothing about. My computer screens displayed code for a revolutionary app I'd been developing, projected earnings that would dwarf his annual salary, and investment accounts that had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I started my career. For 2 years, I'd been building something extraordinary while keeping it secret from everyone, including my father. What had started as a simple project management tool for my company had evolved into a comprehensive platform that major corporations were desperate to license. The software I'd created in my spare time was generating income that made Linda's expensive renovations look like pocket change. I'd been planning to surprise my father with my success eventually, maybe when I bought my own house or reached some arbitrary milestone that felt worthy of celebration. But his crisis had accelerated my timeline in ways I never could have anticipated. The solution to his problem was sitting in my bank account, but revealing it would change everything about our relationship and his understanding of who I'd become. That evening, I drove to the house with documents I'd printed from my financial accounts, legal papers I'd had my attorney prepare, and a plan that would save the house while teaching everyone involved some painful lessons about respect and consequences. My father was sitting in the living room, surrounded by boxes he'd started packing, looking older than his 59 years as he faced the prospect of losing everything he'd worked for. I sat down across from him and pulled out the foreclosure notice, studying the numbers that represented his financial disaster. The total amount needed to bring the mortgage current was $67,000, including principal, interest, late fees, and legal costs. It was a sum that seemed impossible for a man whose retirement savings had been depleted and whose credit was destroyed. "Dad," I said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about my financial situation. Something I've been keeping private because I wanted to build my success without anyone's help or interference. I've been working on a software project for the past 2 years, and it's generated significantly more income than my regular job. My father looked up from the boxes he'd been packing, confusion evident in his expression as he tried to process what I was telling him. He knew I was good with computers, but the idea that I might have created something valuable enough to solve his crisis was beyond his comprehension of my capabilities. I opened my laptop and showed him screenshots of my bank accounts, investment portfolios, and licensing agreements that demonstrated the scope of my success. The numbers were staggering even to me sometimes, representing financial independence I'd achieved while he was drowning in debt he'd accumulated trying to satisfy Linda's expensive dreams. My father stared at the screen in disbelief, scrolling through account balances that exceeded his lifetime earnings from manufacturing work. "How is this possible?" he whispered, his voice barely audible as he absorbed the reality that his daughter had become wealthy while he was facing homelessness. I explained the software I'd developed, the companies that were licensing it, the ongoing revenue stream that grew every month as more organizations implemented my platform. I'd been reinvesting most of the profits to build the business, living modestly while accumulating wealth that could change both our lives permanently. The conversation that followed was unlike anything we'd ever shared before. My father struggled to understand how I'd achieved such success without his knowledge or guidance, while I tried to explain why I'd kept my accomplishments secret from the family that had raised me to be independent and self-sufficient. I told him about my decision to remain quiet about my success, wanting to prove myself without the complications that money brings to family relationships. I'd watched Linda manipulate him with promises and expectations, and I'd been determined to build authentic connections based on who I was rather than what I could provide. But now, I continued, his crisis required me to reveal what I'd been building in secret. I could pay off the mortgage entirely, clearing the debt that threatened to destroy his future while ensuring that the house remained in our family where it belonged. My father's initial reaction was relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes. The crushing weight of financial pressure that had been destroying his health and his peace of mind could be lifted with a single transaction. But his relief was quickly followed by confusion about why I was willing to help and what I expected in return. I had conditions, I explained, terms that would ensure this crisis never happened again while protecting both of us from future manipulation. First, the house would be transferred into my name, with my father retaining lifetime rights to live there but no authority to mortgage or sell the property. Second, Linda would be permanently banned from the premises, with legal documentation that prevented her from claiming any interest in the property or its contents. Third, my father would undergo financial counseling to understand how he'd been manipulated and to develop strategies for avoiding similar situations in the future. Fourth, any future romantic relationships would be disclosed to me immediately, with my approval required before any financial commitments were made on behalf of our family. The conditions were non-negotiable, I told him firmly. I was willing to save the house and secure his future, but only if he agreed to protections that would prevent another Linda from destroying what we rebuilt together. My father listened to my terms with growing understanding of how completely his poor judgment had jeopardized everything our family had worked to achieve. He agreed to every condition without hesitation, recognizing that my intervention was the only thing standing between him and complete financial ruin. Within a week, I'd arranged for attorneys to handle the property transfer and mortgage payoff, accountants to structure the transaction in the most tax-efficient manner possible, and contractors to begin reversing some of Linda's more ostentatious renovations in favor of improvements that reflected our family's actual values and lifestyle. The master suite was redesigned to be beautiful but modest, removing the hotel-like luxury Linda had insisted upon in favor of comfort and practicality. The expensive fixtures were replaced with quality alternatives that would serve my father's needs without the pretentious atmosphere Linda had created. I also arranged for financial counseling sessions that helped my father understand the psychological techniques Linda had used to manipulate his decision-making. He learned to recognize emotional manipulation disguised as love, financial pressure presented as investment opportunity, and guilt used as a tool to override practical judgment. The transformation in my father was remarkable as the stress of potential homelessness was replaced by gratitude and renewed purpose. He returned to his regular work schedule, no longer needing constant overtime to meet impossible financial obligations. He began taking care of his health again, eating regular meals and getting sufficient sleep for the first time in months. Most importantly, He began processing the emotional damage Linda had inflicted through her manipulation and unrealistic expectations. The financial counseling sessions included therapy components that helped him understand how his grief over my mother's death had made him vulnerable to someone who exploited his desire to be needed and appreciated. Linda's reaction to learning about my intervention was predictably self-serving. She contacted my father repeatedly, demanding to know details about the financial arrangements and suggesting that his improved circumstances meant they could reconcile and resume their marriage. She seemed incapable of understanding that her behavior had permanently damaged any possibility of rebuilding their relationship. When Linda discovered that she was legally prohibited from entering the property, she threatened legal action, claiming she had contributed to the house's improvements and deserved compensation for her efforts. My attorneys quickly demonstrated that her contributions had been funded entirely by debt my father had incurred, leaving her with no legal claim to the property or its contents. Linda's sons Miguel and Carlos reached out to thank me for helping their mother understand the consequences of her actions. They revealed that Linda had exhibited similar patterns in previous relationships, using emotional manipulation to pressure partners into funding lifestyle improvements they couldn't afford. They hoped that losing access to my father's resources might motivate her to develop more realistic expectations about relationships and financial responsibility. Over the following months, I established new routines that allowed me to spend time at the house while building my business from the home office I created in what had once been Linda's elaborate walk-in closet. The irony wasn't lost on me that the space designed to house her expensive wardrobe became the headquarters for the software company that had saved our family home. My father and I developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than the parent-child dynamic that had defined our previous interactions. He began asking my advice about financial decisions, home maintenance priorities, and life choices in general. I consulted him about business strategies, family traditions I wanted to preserve, and plans for the future that included both our goals and dreams. The house itself underwent a gradual transformation that honored my mother's memory while incorporating modern conveniences that improved daily life without creating unnecessary luxury. We restored my mother's rose garden, which Linda had neglected during her residence, and recreated family spaces that reflected our actual values rather than Linda's aspirations for social status. I established a foundation that provided financial literacy education for people facing foreclosure, having learned firsthand how quickly poor decisions can destroy decades of responsible financial management. The foundation also offered support for children of manipulative relationships, helping them understand boundary setting and recognize warning signs of emotional manipulation. My software business continued growing rapidly, attracting attention from major technology companies interested in acquisition offers that would provide generational wealth for our family. But I chose to maintain independence, building the company according to my own values rather than external pressures for rapid expansion or profit maximization. The success I'd achieved felt meaningful because it had emerged from genuine problem solving, rather than lucky speculation or inherited advantage. Every milestone represented skills I'd developed, challenges I'd overcome, and value I'd created for customers who benefited from my innovations. My father frequently expressed amazement at what I'd accomplished, but I reminded him that my success was built on the foundation of values he and my mother had instilled in me. Their emphasis on education, hard work, and integrity had provided the framework for achievements that might have seemed impossible when I was growing up in their modest household. Linda occasionally attempted to re-establish contact, usually around holidays or significant dates when she felt particularly entitled to forgiveness and reconciliation. My father learned to recognize these patterns and respond with firm boundaries that protected his emotional well-being, while making clear that her choices had permanent consequences. The financial counseling sessions had taught my father to distinguish between genuine remorse and manipulative apologies designed to regain access to resources. Linda's communications typically focused on her own difficulties and needs, rather than acknowledging the damage her behavior had caused or demonstrating understanding of why reconciliation was impossible. As my father's 62nd birthday approached, I organized a celebration that included extended family members who had been supportive during the crisis, but unable to provide financial assistance. The party was held in our restored backyard, where my mother's roses bloomed magnificently around the oak tree that had sheltered 3 generations of family gatherings. During the celebration, my father gave a speech thanking everyone for their support, while acknowledging the mistakes that had nearly cost him everything he valued. He spoke about lessons learned, relationships that had proven their worth during difficult times, and gratitude for second chances that allowed him to rebuild his life according to his actual priorities. The transformation in our family's circumstances felt profound but also natural, as if we'd simply returned to values and relationships that reflected who we'd always been beneath the surface disruption Linda had created. The house felt like home again, filled with warmth and authenticity rather than the artificial luxury that had characterized Linda's residence. My father began dating again eventually, but with wisdom gained from his experience with Linda. He chose partners who shared his values, demonstrated emotional maturity, and maintained their own financial independence rather than seeking security through relationships. The contrast with Linda was striking, highlighting how manipulation had masked fundamental incompatibilities that should have been obvious from the beginning. The mortgage crisis that had nearly destroyed my father's future became the catalyst for changes that strengthened our family relationships while demonstrating the importance of authentic connections over financial arrangements. My success had provided the resources to solve immediate problems, but the real transformation came from learned wisdom about boundaries, respect, and the difference between love and manipulation. Looking back, I realized that keeping my financial success secret had been the right decision, allowing me to help from a position of strength when help was truly needed, rather than creating dependency or changing family dynamics prematurely. The crisis had revealed everyone's true character while providing opportunities for growth that might never have emerged under easier circumstances. My father's experience with Linda taught both of us valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation, maintaining financial boundaries, and understanding that genuine love supports rather than exploits the people we care about. The house that had nearly been lost to poor decisions became the foundation for a stronger, wiser family built on mutual respect and authentic connection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.